The most famous film critic, the name most known far and wide, is probably Roger Ebert, plus his two big former collaborators, Gene Siskel and Richard Roeper. On the next rung down, you have the likes of long-standing major publication critics like Peter Travers of Rolling Stone, Pauline Kael of The New Yorker, and Rex Reed of The Observer, GQ, The New York Times, and more. He's one of those rock star critics who achieved genuine celebrity status from his reviews. But it's kind of hard to tell why if you actually read his reviews. For a long time, I'd seen his name used in pull quotes on posters and DVD cases, and I'd only heard the name Rex Reed referred to as one of the top dog critics without ever personally reading any of his reviews. But that changed after I stumbled across an IndieWire article from a decade ago calling him the worst film critic of all time. This was a surprise to me for two reasons. One, because I had previously only heard Rex Reed's name spoken with reverence, and two, because I thought we were all in agreement that Armand White is definitively the world's worst film critic. By the way, I have an older video about Armand White, an unscripted video, that you can find linked in the description. But yeah, this IndieWire article from Sam Adams certainly doesn't mince words. I mean, just listen to the opening paragraph, quote, "The movie reviews of Rex Reed inspire fierce debate. Questions like, is he the worst critic alive or the worst critic in history? Is he a terrible writer or a terrible person who happens to write? Is he a greater waste of column inches or oxygen?" End quote. That is so brutal. And this isn't even the only IndieWire article that takes a vehemently anti-Rex Reed stance. That publication hates his guts. And it turns out a lot of other people do too, despite his prestigious reputation as one of the big recognizable names in film criticism.
This reflects on somebody I won't be missing on your show, Rex Reed. No, just a minute.
Okay, all right.
I won't miss Rex Reed at all. And I'll tell you why. I don't like him. I'll tell you why I don't like him. Last night I saw Rex review a movie with my friends in it, Dan and John. They're very funny guys. They work very hard. And Rex's review was something to the effect of, "That fat slob, John Belushi played a fat slob." This guy's a dip. I don't like him. But when people do things like say things that nasty about movies, I don't want to see him on the air.
My curiosity was piqued, and I ended up reading tons and tons and tons of his reviews from the last 2+ decades to determine for myself if he's worthy of all the hate that IndieWire and others have flung at him. And my conclusion, in short, yes, he deserves all the hate. To put it bluntly, he's a terrible film critic. He doesn't articulate his opinions well. The bulk of his reviews are just summarizing the plot without comment, which is not what film criticism is, and it's the laziest type of review possible. He doesn't seem to understand the art form more than any random person off the street, and he routinely carves out space within his reviews to insult and belittle both the people involved in making the films and any audience members who enjoy the films that he doesn't, which makes those absolutely brutal IndieWire comments totally warranted. It's just meeting him at his level. For one of the most notorious instances of Rex Reed's personal attacks slipped into his reviews, we can look to his hateful obsession with Melissa McCarthy. It's fine to like her or not like her. You can find her funny or not find her funny. You can like her movies or hate them, whatever. That's all fair game. But it does not qualify as film criticism to insult her for her weight over and over again while saying very little or nothing at all about the films themselves. Imagine writing a review where your criticism is, the lead actress is fat, 1 star out of 4. That's a reality for Rex Reed. He has gone out of his way to call Melissa McCarthy, quote, a gimmick comedian who has dedicated her short career to being obese. And he also called her humongous, tractor-sized, and a female hippo. And if you assume that those insults were scattered around different reviews, no, it was in a single review, his review for Identity Thief, which, yeah, most people agree is a terrible movie, but Melissa McCarthy's body isn't what normal, non-disgusting people dislike the movie for, but that does seem to be Rex Reed's main issue with the movie. He managed to circle back around to her weight no less than 4 times in a review that is in total barely 3 paragraphs long. IndieWire specifically called out his gross comments about Melissa McCarthy in a different article, and Rex Reed responded by just doubling down and saying he had nothing to be sorry for, which of course was his stance. Keep an eye out for more personal attacks from Rex fired at audiences, actors, filmmakers, as we look at more examples of his reviews. There will be plenty of that. But I'm going to mostly be focusing on a different aspect of Rex Reed's reviews, his propensity to either not comprehend, not pay attention to, or not even watch the films he's meant to be reviewing. Rex gets things wrong about the films he's reviewing constantly, and I'm talking about major plot details here. Sometimes he manages to misunderstand the entire premise of the film. These are the kinds of story details that you would probably call unmissable. But Rex Reed proves that descriptor wrong. And in fact, the notion that he doesn't watch all the films he reviews isn't even speculation. He has admitted to it in the past multiple times. He routinely says in his reviews that he walked out, sometimes only about 15 or 20 minutes in, but that he still reviews the entire film anyway. Take his review of VHS 2, for example. Here's a quote. "Diabolically psychotic, submental, and completely unwatchable disaster that I happily deserted when a man with a retinal implant scooped out his bionic eye with a sharp object, splattering blood all over the camera." By the way, Rex's aversion to blood is a through line across all of his reviews. It turns out he's an extremely squeamish dude when it comes to violence. And I mean violence of any kind, not just horror gore like he's talking about here. You'll find that any amount of blood makes Rex clutch his pearls and start calling the movie depraved and unwatchable. That's the kind of weenie this guy is. Again, to be clear, if you don't like gory movies, that's totally fine. What's not fine is condemning and insulting the people who make and enjoy gory movies, which Rex does all the time. He cannot handle horror films, which I have to say is kind of a deal breaker for someone reviewing horror films. He also calls the film, quote, indescribably gory, and this is another Rex Reed hallmark to look out for. He constantly calls things indescribable or incomprehensible, and all that means is that he personally isn't capable of describing or comprehending the things that he's supposedly reviewing. But let's get back to that first quote. "I happily deserted when a man with a retinal implant scooped out his bionic eye with a sharp object." If you haven't seen VHS 2, or if it's just been a long time, it's a vignette movie divided into 5 tapes, with one of them being a wraparound framing device that is interspersed throughout the film. After the first tease of the framing device, the segment in which the guy removes his bionic eye is the first fucking tape. So what is he even calling indescribably gory? The only gore he made it to in the film was, quote, "a man with a retinal implant scooped out his bionic eye with a sharp object, splattering blood over the camera." You described it right there, dude. But no, he wants it to sound a lot worse than what actually happened, so he calls it indescribably gory. Rex saw such a tiny sliver of the entire film before walking out and reviewing the whole thing. The fact that it's a vignette film makes it even worse because each tape was made by a different team of filmmakers, but he's insulting and trashing the entire package that everyone worked on, even though he didn't see most of the other people's work. All of the directors are named in the review. He calls all of them amateurs, and he calls them, quote, 7 unknown directors hell-bent on remaining that way, even though he admits to walking out before seeing the work of 6 out of the 7 directors that he's insulting. How does that make sense, Rex? You're barely qualified to critique that first tape, but you have no right to trash the other 4 tapes that you weren't even in the fucking room for. He even pads out his review by describing the basic gist of what happens in the other tapes. You know, the segments that he didn't get to, the ones he didn't watch, which makes it so obvious that he just looked at little plot blurbs that were sent to him or that he copied down in his own words. By the way, when he calls them all unknown directors, he's saying that in a similar way to how he calls things indescribable when he's personally incapable of describing them. Unknown directors just means unknown to him, and he's too lazy to even just Google their names to find out that one of them is the guy who made The Raid, and 2 of them are the guys who made the goddamn Blair Witch Project, you know, one of the most famous and profitable horror films ever made. Don't know why anyone would expect a professional critic to have heard of that little indie. These tapes are all completely standalone, and it's straight up disingenuous and unethical to trash all of them after only watching one of them. The VHS series does have a lot of bad tapes in them, but there are also some real gems, and the highlight of the entire franchise is in this movie. It's in VHS too. But oh, it's the third tape? There's no way Rex could make it that far. I'm talking about Safe Haven, the tape co-directed by the aforementioned Raid director Gareth Evans and Timo Sargento, which is a genuinely fantastic standalone horror short film. It's also the segment that's featured in the image that is in Rex's review. The only image in the whole review is a screenshot from a segment that he didn't watch. Ridiculous. If you thought this was an isolated incident, then, well, I mean, you just haven't been paying attention or didn't look at the title of this video. Let's take a quick look at his review for The Shape of Water. To start out with, he said that the film was directed by Benicio del Toro instead of Guillermo del Toro, and he had to issue a correction after publication. The little correction note at the bottom doesn't mention this, but according to IndieWire, the first version of the review also said that he was from Spain when he's actually from Mexico. Oh, also, he apparently spelled Benicio wrong too. So it's not even just the wrong name, but he spelled the name wrong too. It couldn't be wrong one way, it had to be a triple whammy. But even after that correction, the current version of the review that's still up is just awful. First, Rex takes the odd stance of hating the main character simply because she's mute. Not in a way where he has any kind of point. He's not saying like, well, the film would be better if she expressed herself more. Nothing like that. That's not his take. His take is so much more facile and dumb than you can possibly imagine. His take is just that people who are mute in real life are gross and weird, and he doesn't like them and doesn't want to have to look at them. Like, what the fuck kind of a take is that? What kind of film critic just openly despises someone because of their disability, Rex, you asshole? He starts the review by explaining that the main character is a mute woman who cleans toilets. Then he immediately calls her, quote, the pathetic girl in the next sentence. He says that Sally Hawkins specializes in playing, quote, defective creatures, because the year before she played a character that had rheumatoid arthritis. Yeah, anyone with any sort of disability or impairment is a defective creature to Rex Reed, and he's filled with vitriol toward them. He also says that in this role, Hawkins is at, quote, her most endearing repulsiveness. Again, just because the character is mute. Repulsiveness? You find mute people repulsive, Rex? Really? What is wrong with you? The rest of the review is mostly just summarizing the plot, which again does not count as film criticism. But I did save the most baffling detail for last. When he's explaining her character at the start, right after calling her pathetic and defective and whatnot, he says, quote, her face is in fact burned into scar tissue, end quote. And it's like, Rex, what are you talking about? This is her face in the movie. Does it look burned into scar tissue to you? Like, hello, what movie did you watch? She's got some tiny scars on her neck, but her face is not burned in scar tissue. That's such a weird detail to invent, Rex. It's almost like he's trying to make it more justifiable that he found himself repulsed by a mute woman. As crazy as it sounds, this is just the first example of many of Rex inventing and then criticizing something that definitively didn't happen in the film he's reviewing. Let's look at his review of Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman, for example, where Rex describes so many plot points that don't actually happen in the film, which makes it seem like he either didn't watch it and just read a faulty Cliff Notes summary of it, or that he at least wasn't paying any attention to it, like he was making dinner or something in the other room and only heard the faint audio from the TV. Except he apparently watches all these films in theaters rather than screeners sent to him. Otherwise, I don't know how he's doing all these walkouts, though I do love the idea of Rex being so grossed out by a tiny bit of blood on screen that he physically flees his own home. Just like usual, the majority of the review is just summarizing the plot, albeit incorrectly. Right at the start, he attempts to explain the basic premise of the entire film and somehow gets it completely wrong. He's explaining Matthew McConaughey's character and says, quote, his gang uses the latest technology to grow and market a lethal drug called White Widow Super Cheese, end quote. And here's the thing, anyone who's seen the film knows that it's not some lethal super drug. It's weed. It's marijuana, Rex. The guy's just a fucking pot farmer. It's not that crazy complicated. It's not that hard to understand. I would have thought it was impossible to miss because there's pot everywhere. They walk through fucking pot warehouses for half the fucking movie. How do you miss that? It's just pot, Rex. It's not some wild new lethal drug. How would that even work? You call him the richest and most powerful drug lord in the UK. How could that possibly be the case if his product is a lethal super drug that kills anyone who uses it? Use your brain, Rex. He's a drug kingpin. He's not a Batman villain trying to kill everyone in Gotham. He also gets other plot points completely wrong, like saying that there are multiple feuding Chinese drug gangs, which just isn't the case. There's one Chinese gangster feuding with McConaughey, but I don't know if you noticed, Rex, but McConaughey is not a Chinese drug gang. Not sure how you got that one wrong. Just like I'm not sure how you watched the scene where a guy has sex with a pig, but for some reason wrote that the pig kills and eats him instead. Like, those are such completely different actions. How in the world did you interpret that so incorrectly? And just for good measure, he also balks at the violence in the film, even though it's really not that violent of a movie at all. He says it's filled with, quote, unspeakable violence, which, as we've covered, just means that he's incapable of articulating his thoughts on the violence, so he just calls it unspeakable. And just for the record, I don't even like The Gentleman. I agree that it's not a good movie, but you don't have to invent all these imaginary plot details in order to criticize it. Criticize it for what actually happens in the movie, Rex. It's not that hard. Even these extensive incorrect assertions are still just child's play compared to the most egregious misinterpretation I've found from him, which can be found in his review of Cabin in the Woods. Yeah, you know, that great deconstructionist horror comedy. It probably doesn't come as a surprise at this point that Rex didn't get the self-aware meta angle of the film. But it's worse than just that. He somehow walked away from this film thinking that it's about video games, somehow, for some reason, despite there being absolutely no video game component to the plot, despite there being zero mention of video games, despite there not being anything that anyone who actually watched the film could even mistake for video games. Rex somehow built his entire review around his impressively wrong take that the whole film is about video games. And he thinks video games are for nerds, so the movie sucks. And I'm not kidding, that really is his stance. Just look at his headline. The Cabin in the Woods is a pixelated nightmare. And right below it, before the review starts, real life horror story come video game has narrative glitches, needs to be unplugged. He immediately positions the review entirely around this weird video game thing that is 100% not part of the movie. And I can't even wrap my head around why he thinks it's about video games. How do you misunderstand an entire film so thoroughly and in such a weird way? It almost seems like Rex is on hallucinogenics when he watches these movies, and then what he's reviewing is actually the trip he went on instead of the actual movie. And speaking of drugs, he opens this review by accusing the screenwriters of penning the script while on crystal meth, which is just a weird thing to put in your review of a clever horror comedy. And then again, most of the review is just summarizing the plot, but incorrectly and while not understanding the humor of the horror cliches that are being parodied and deconstructed. You might think that reading the review would offer some hint as to how he mistook the film for being about video games, but no, it doesn't make any more sense in context. Go ahead and read his full review for yourself to see. He just halfway through the review writes, quote, "It's all part of an elaborate video game that allows paying customers to watch real people slaughtered according to the horror of choice. The 5 kids in the cabin are innocent pawns to test the mechanics of the game." Rex is not even reviewing Cabin in the Woods. He's reviewing some movie that doesn't exist that he whipped up in his own head. It's hard to believe that he watched this whole film. But then he mentions the Sigourney Weaver cameo at the end in a way that almost feels like him trying to prove that he watched it. Like, see, I didn't walk out of a horror movie for once. But he either lacks basic comprehension skills, or a competing theory I have is that we know Rex is extremely squeamish when it comes to blood. So maybe he watched the whole film like this, like turning away from the, maybe he watched it doing that kind of thing. And maybe that self-imposed obfuscation is what led Rex down the baffling road to thinking that it's all a video game for some reason. And he keeps going on and on like this, calling it the game, calling the characters the players, saying the game only ends if the virgin survives. And again, Rex, you're not just wrong, you're impressively wrong. The game only ends if the virgin survives. No, just no, Rex. There is no video game. And with the virgin thing, he's referring to the reveal at the end with the aforementioned Sigourney Weaver cameo. But he's apparently mistaking the literal world ending with this hallucinated video game ending. And he apparently missed the fact that the character that he keeps repeatedly calling the Virgin is not actually a virgin, and that that's one of the jokes and clever moments of subversion in the movie.
The Virgin. Me. Virgin. We work with what we have.
And that's not even getting into the fact that the conflict in the final scene is not about whether or not the Virgin survives. It's about whether or not she's going to kill her stoner friend to complete the ritual. But it's pointless trying to explain to Rex Reed the nuances of a movie he clearly didn't pay any attention to before reviewing. He also describes another scene that just straight up isn't in the movie when he writes, quote, "Vampires circle the moon and suck the hot stud's blood," end quote. Oh, do they? Did that happen, Rex? Because I must have missed the scene where vampires circled the moon and sucked the hot stud's blood. I don't recall that scene happening. Maybe he was paying attention. Maybe he was paying more attention than me, or anyone else who watched the film. Did you fall asleep in the theater, Rex? Did you have a little nap and dream about a hot stud getting sucked? Because I dream about that too, but I don't wake up and write a movie review about it afterwards. And lest we not forget the obligatory part of the review where he makes a brain-dead personal attack on anyone who enjoyed the film, or really anyone who just even comprehended the film, apparently. Listen to this shit. He calls the film, quote, "time-wasting drivel designed to appeal to electronics nerds and skateboarders addicted to Xbox 360 video games whose knowledge of the arts begins and ends with MTV2, instead of electronic wands like the Nintendo's Wii controllers. The master fiends working the control panels, tap buttons, and pull levers straight out of Dr. Strangelove," end quote. What the fuck are you talking about, Rex? What the fuck is that? You are so far down the rabbit hole of your own bizarre misunderstanding. Rex, buddy, I'm sorry to say it, but I think you might be a little too dumb for this line of work. The craziest part about this isn't even Rex's weird flights of fancy. It's how he's been able to be so prominent and successful for decades, while simultaneously being such a rude, thick-headed dilettante. Oh god, this video is getting long. I could end it here, but honestly, there are still a bunch of other examples that I want to look at, like his review of 3 Billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, in which he not only gets major plot points completely wrong, but he also carves out the space to get the plots of Martin McDonagh's other films wrong too, as if he's competing to be as thoroughly incorrect as possible. Again, he's super pearl clutchy about the violence in the film. Even though it isn't really that violent at all, he says it's filled with, quote, "unspeakable violence." And he calls it grand guignol, which is a term he loves to label movies if they contain any level of violence. And I think it's because he knows it's a term that lots of people won't be familiar with, so he can use it in a way that is clearly derisive, but also makes him seem smarter to his readers. Grand guignol is a reference to an old French theater known for super graphic horror performances on the stage. I only know the term because someone called my first novel in the grand guignol tradition, and I had to Google to see what it meant. By the way, my novels The Fall of Polite and South of the Mason-Dixon are available in print and ebook. And South of the Mason-Dixon is even available as an audiobook. You can check the description for links. The Fall of Polite is a post-apocalyptic revenge thriller, and South of the Mason-Dixon is a little slice of southern fried horror for you. But if Rex Reed reviewed these books, he would probably think they're about basketball or some shit. Just like he thinks In Bruges is about a racist dwarf hooked on horse tranquilizers. Oh, is that what it's about? Is that what the whole film revolves around? Or do you just think that's what it's about because you only watched one scene out of context? Or maybe you just heard about one scene secondhand. He also calls Seven Psychopaths a horror film, which it clearly isn't even close to being, though I could see how Rex might assume that if all he was going off was the title. But apparently not. He has a full review for that movie too, and he calls it one of the worst movies ever made. He also says that In Bruges was Martin McDonagh's follow-up to Seven Psychopaths, despite In Bruges coming out 4 years before Seven Psychopaths. So that's how many mistakes already? And he hasn't even said anything about 3 Billboards yet, the film he's supposedly reviewing. Anyway, after that, Rex goes through the standard part of his reviews, where he just summarizes the plot for most of the word count. And as usual, he gets it not just completely wrong, but impressively wrong in such a weird way. He says that Sam Rockwell's character Dixon, quote, goes berserk and sets fire to the courthouse, burning half his face off. Mildred, meanwhile, blows up the police station, end quote. This is another one of those instances where I find myself asking, Rex, how could you possibly walk away from this film thinking that's what happened? The second part is right. Mildred does blow up the police station, or, well, she lights it on fire, which I wouldn't exactly call blowing something up, which would imply a bomb, but you know what, whatever, that's close enough for Rex. It's the first part that is completely wrong. First of all, there is no courthouse. He goes berserk and sets fire to the courthouse? No, doesn't happen. There is no courthouse in this film, let alone one on fire. But not only is there no courthouse, Dixon doesn't go berserk and set fire to anything. None of that happens in the film. It just doesn't. It's not in there. Watch the movie. It doesn't happen. For those who haven't seen the film or it's just been a while, here's what actually happens. Dixon is in the police station, not the courthouse, the police station, reading. He's just in there reading, very passively just reading a document. Not going berserk, certainly not lighting anything on fire, just reading. While he's in there reading, Mildred sets the building on fire, not knowing he's inside. That's what actually happens. So yeah, it's not two different events like Rex described, it's one event, and that's plainly obvious to anyone who paid attention. But also, that's a huge part of the arc of both characters and a major turning point in the film, that Mildred injures him so severely by accident. But Rex missed all of that because he thinks Dixon went berserk, and that all of his injuries were self-inflicted. And I guess that he wanted to burn a courthouse down for some reason. Even if Rex likes and recommends a movie, he still gets so many things wrong about it. He can't even pay attention when it's a film he enjoys. Take his review of The Dark Knight, for example, where he makes one of the weirdest criticisms I've ever seen. Maybe someone in the comments can help make sense of the point that Rex is trying to make here, because I genuinely cannot wrap my head around it. He mentions that he hated Nolan's first Batman movie, then says, quote, "The Dark Knight takes up where it left off, but if it's a follow-up that introduces a comprehensive sociopath called the Joker, then how do you explain the fact that the Joker made his debut years ago as Jack Nicholson? It's just one of the things that makes no sense. But hey-ho, since when did Batman and Logic morph?" End quote. Rex, please, what does that mean? How do you explain that the Joker was played by Jack Nicholson in a different movie? What needs explaining, Rex? What are you confused by? How do I explain Nicholson playing the Joker in a different movie? It's a different movie! That's how I explain it, Rex. It's a different movie, released like 20 years earlier. What is possibly confusing about that? You're not confused by Batman being played by Christian Bale now instead of Michael Keaton, so why are you confused by a different actor playing the Joker? Rex, it's annoying how stupid you are. That's not the only issue with this review either. There's a lot more. Rex somehow watched the scene where a cell phone was used as a detonator for a bomb, but he didn't understand that it was a detonator for a bomb. No, he thought that it was a magic cell phone. He really thought it was a magic cell phone that just blows up buildings when you point it at him. Oh God, you're dumb. Right before that, he wrote, quote, "I liked it better when Playboy Bruce Wayne lived in a dark underground cave with or without Robin. Now he's in a penthouse with sunshine pouring through glass walls and breakfast served in bed by Michael Caine." End quote. That's like, Rex, that's not a change. Bruce Wayne was always a rich dude in a big house with a butler. Bruce Wayne didn't live in the Batcave. Did you forget that he's always been rich and Alfred's always been there in all the Batman incarnations? That's not new to this one. What are you talking about? And then again in the same paragraph, he writes a third thing that also makes no sense. He says, quote, "A Batman costume that is more than a rack item from the studio wardrobe department. Now he actually sprouts bat wings and flies like Bela Lugosi." With flying like Bela Lugosi, meaning Dracula, meaning he literally transforms into a bat and flaps around. Rex, my man, that does not happen. At no point in any of the Nolan Batman movies does he literally sprout bat wings and flap around. I guess you were on the hallucinogenics again for this one, but that doesn't happen. Oh, okay, I feel like I've ridiculed Rex Reed enough at this point, so I'll close by looking at one of his reviews that is so bad that the publication actually took it down entirely. This isn't bad so much for its inaccuracy, but more so because of some pretty intense xenophobia. So you can add that to Rex's list of undesirable traits. Pop xenophobia on his dating profile. I'm talking about his review of Oldboy. If you search for that review today, you'll find his review of the Oldboy remake, but it's his review of the original that we're after. I tried finding it in the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive, and I did find the page that the review was formerly hosted on, but the review itself is scrubbed from even there. But then I found the full review reproduced within a blog post. So shout out to the blog Green Fertility for reproducing it. Rex calls Oldboy Grand Guignol again, and he also calls it, quote, sewage in a cocktail shaker. In the second sentence of the review, he writes, quote, what else can you expect from a nation weaned on kimchi? A mixture of raw garlic and cabbage and blah, blah, blah. He just spends the next whole paragraph ranting about how he thinks kimchi is gross, and he's super judgmental of all Korean people because kimchi is just popular there. That's really how he decided to spend the fucking opening paragraph of his review. He then goes on to call South Korea as a whole, quote, a nation of emerging cinematic schlock. The South Korean film industry has been responsible for so many of the best films released over the past couple of decades. But Rex writes off the entire country's film output and culture because he doesn't like kimchi, I guess. Then, like usual, most of the review is just summarizing the plot, and then he writes, quote, what is going on here? Nobody knows. Rex, everybody knows except you fucking idiot. He acts like it's just random and confusing and doesn't make sense, but he's really just either too thick to follow the plot, or he didn't pay any attention because he was too blinded by his weird disdain of kimchi and everyone who eats it. Probably a combination of the two. He also writes that, quote, a severed hand rips out a man's teeth, end quote. There's a scene where Odaisu rips out teeth, but a severed hand? What are you talking about? How would that even work? Does Rex think there's a floating animated hand in this movie? A fucking disembodied hand that wandered out of the Addams family and started yanking teeth? Rex, buddy, if you cover your eyes because you can't stand the gore, don't just guess at what you think happened, because you're no good at it and you're prone to wild flights of fancy. And it should come as no surprise that he circles back around to his xenophobia before the end of the review. He calls the film part kung fu, which it just definitively is not. There's only one big fight scene, and it's absolutely not a kung fu fight scene. That descriptor is just dripping with racism. You know 100% that if this scene was performed by a bunch of white guys, he would never think to call it kung fu. Because it's not. Then later in the same sentence, he calls the film part Charlie Chan murder mystery, which, if you aren't aware, is a real deep-cut xenophobic reference to a character from the 1920s who was notoriously played by multiple different white guys pretending to be Asian. Rex just wanted to reference an Asian-sounding character. A character who, by the way, is a detective from Hawaii. How the fuck is that relevant, Rex? Oldboy is nothing like a Charlie Chan mystery. Then, just for good measure, Rex crams a third xenophobic comment into the very same sentence and calls the film, quote, part metaphysical oriental mumbo jumbo, end quote. Jesus Christ, Rex, maybe stick to reviewing American movies, you racist fuck. I mean, or don't, you could stop reviewing those too. But no, he's still reviewing movies. He just reviewed Killers of the Flower Moon recently, and he complained that it was hard on his poor little short attention span. And he said that, quote, I found myself glancing at my watch occasionally and dozing off quite often. If you fall asleep at a film quite often, you are not qualified to review it afterwards. And of course he makes weird mistakes in here too, like calling Brendan Fraser's character bald when he very clearly has a full head of hair. And it's like, that doesn't even matter. Even if it was true, it's a completely irrelevant detail. Oh, but hang on, I wasn't done with the Oldboy review. At the end of that same sentence, where he did that xenophobic triple whammy, he ended by calling the entire film incomprehensible. And yeah, that's true, it is incomprehensible to Rex. Rex, personally, is incapable of comprehending it. That much of the review is 100% accurate. And only after all that does he finally admit that, quote, I walked out, end quote. Of course he did. Do you think maybe the film made a little more sense if you watched the whole thing before deciding to review it, Rex? Do you think that's possible? Maybe, but maybe not, given that he was clearly covering his eyes for all the violence and not paying attention to the plot anyway. Oh, okay, geez, this video spiraled out of control and got much longer than I intended for it to be. I actually wrote out a whole extra segment on his awful review of Arrival, but I ended up cutting that one all together. And he has tons of other reviews that are just as weirdly inaccurate as these ones, but I think the point has been thoroughly made. Thanks for watching. You can stick around if you want, blah, 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 whatever. No one's watching this point. The video's over. I'm gonna collapse now.